I just recently had a person call me because they're concerned that their dog is snapping at the 4-year-old out of the blue. One of my favorite dog training books is this one right here, Dog Language, an Encyclopedia. The one section that I want to go over here today is abnormal behavior, which is on page 37. So if you have this book for your reference, I know I've had it for a long time. I don't always read it all the time, but it is a good book to go back for reference, to give me a little bit of a refresher, sort of to remind me of some points. Also, when you have a specific case that sometimes gets your attention, it gets you thinking a little bit. I've found that this book, because it's formatted in an encyclopedic manner, which means it's A through Z. So it's a great reference book. It's not by chapters, it's not by topics, it's strictly A through Z, just like a dictionary. Now, if you don't know a whole lot about the book, Roger Abrantes is an ethologist that has spent a very long time of his career, really big part of his career, studying canine behavior, looking at wolf behavior, dog behavior. And if you're a dog owner, if you're a savvy dog owner, it's a good reference book as well, because sometimes I get dog owners, clients even, they'll ask me questions like, hey, why does my dog do this? Now, as my clients, my job is not to make them dog training experts or experts in body language. My job is to help them with their particular dog, with their particular case. But there are pieces of information that they don't need. I don't want to clutter their minds with, hey, this is something that you should probably study for your dog. So as a dog owner, if you want additional information, you want to learn a little bit more about your dog, I've found that this is a good book for that as well. I'm going to be going over abnormal behavior today because it's just such a nice topic to go back to and refresh your mind on. So I'll give you a brief explanation of this. And I made a video on aggression. I actually made a few videos on aggression. If you go to the podcast, or if you go to the playlist named Podcast on YouTube, and you go to some of the earlier episodes, I made a 3-part episode, or 3 episodes on the topic of aggression, where I cover various types of aggression, why they happen, why they might happen, the symptoms of those aggressive behaviors. And on there, I also talk about abnormal and pathological aggression. So this is a good one to go back to, and I'm going to go over it again now. So it says here, according to the encyclopedia, according to the book. So I love the way he put this. Abnormal behavior is all behavior that quantitatively differs from average behavior. So the difference between abnormal and pathological behavior, so pathological meaning, it doesn't have an apparent cause to it, and he explains that a little bit here as well. The difference between abnormal and pathological behavior is that the latter, meaning pathological, involves greater qualitative differences, while abnormal behavior is an exaggeration of the norm. Okay, so that is a great way to explain it. I'm going to tell you why that's important as a dog owner and even as a dog trainer. So abnormal behavior is an exaggeration of the norm. I love that. It's just such an easy, simple way of describing that. Abnormal behavior is an exaggeration of the norm. So abnormal, meaning it's not entirely normal, okay? But it has its roots in normal behavior. Okay, and it gives you a great example here, which I'm going to break down a little bit more. So it says, for example, if a dog shows extreme aggression every time it sees another dog of the same sex, it is showing abnormal behavior. So why is that abnormal? Well, It differs from the norm. It's an exaggeration of the norm. Okay. Now, do dogs do that? Absolutely. Is there a reason to do that? There is the sense of competition. Every animal, from humans all the way to even bugs, okay? Some bugs even display some of these behaviors. So from humans all the way to some of the smallest animals, they will show competitive behavior. If you put two males of any species, or even two females, but in this particular case, just because he's using the example of the same sex here, okay? And it is an example. If you put a lot of dogs, a lot of animals rather, of the same sex in an environment where there could possibly be some sort of competition for resources or competition for mates, there will be trouble. And it makes sense for there to be trouble. Okay, it makes perfect sense. They're now in direct competition with each other. So it makes sense for them to show some of that aggressive behavior. It makes sense for them to show that competitive behavior. It makes sense for them to show a little bit of hostility because they are directly or indirectly in competition for resources, whether that could be resources like food, whether that could be mates, etc. Okay, so that's why it's abnormal, meaning it has its roots in normal behavior, but it differs from the norm. It differs from the norm. Okay, it's quantitatively different from the average. Okay, so it makes sense, but it is a little bit of an exaggeration of the norm. Now it continues on here because this is great the way he puts it on here. Now he says, this behavior is not likely to be pathological. Remember, pathological is it's like an extreme, meaning there is no reason why it's doing it. Okay, unless it is due to hormonal or organic changes in the brain. So he's saying here is the aggression towards another dog of the same sex, extreme aggression specifically, extreme aggression towards another dog of the same sex is abnormal. Okay, meaning it has its roots in normal. However, this behavior is not likely to be pathological, so it's not likely to be crazy or it has no reason for it to happen unless it is due to a hormonal or organic change in the brain. Hormonal changes can trigger erratic behavior. Okay, it can happen, which means the behaviors are now pathological, which means in this particular case, the extreme aggression would be pathological. It would be meaning that it doesn't make sense and it is due to some sort of chemical change in the brain or some sort of hormonal change in the system, which means the dog could now impulsively just behave aggressive in a manner that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'll give you an example that is a little bit more, maybe a little bit more relatable to what some of you guys may be familiar with. If a person tells you that their dog growls when they're reaching for the toy, so if the dog has a toy and the owner reaches for the toy and the dog growls, well, that is sort of a normal behavior. It has its roots in normal behavior. So it makes sense. It is competition. Now, we don't like it. We're not condoning it. But what we're saying is it makes sense. Most animals, if they have something at the moment that they're giving 100% of their attention to, whether that be a resource or a mate, and something, a third party, interferes with that, most animals are going to show some sort of hostilities. Most animals are going to show some sort of aggressive behavior. That makes sense. It should make sense. It is normal. Okay? So when the owner does that, that makes sense. We don't like to see it. It makes sense. Okay, so an abnormal version of that would be if the dog has a toy and the owner just walks by. So if the dog has a toy or a bone and the owner or a member of the family just walks past the dog, meaning they're not reaching for the bone, they're not reaching for the toy, they're just walking past, not even looking at the dog, but the dog starts to show aggression. Now this is more of an abnormal nature, meaning it has its roots in normal behavior, but it is an exaggeration of the norm. Just like he said, it's an exaggeration of the norm, which makes sense. Look, the dog has a bone, the dog has a toy, and you're not a direct threat. You're not reaching for it. You're simply walking past the dog. And if the dog shows aggression because of that, they show resource guarding because you're just walking past, we can, I believe, agree that this is an exaggeration of the norm, which means it's an abnormal behavior. So it makes sense, right? Competition, but it is an exaggeration of that. We're not even looking at the dog. You have sometimes clients, dog owners, that will tell you about that. They're like, I don't understand why he does. I'm not even looking at him. Right? Just recently, I had a person call me because they're concerned that their dog is snapping at the 4-year-old out of the blue. So the 4-year-old is just kind of walking past and the dog will snap. Did the dog have a good reason for it? We don't know exactly. I did ask a lot of questions. There was an instance in which the child did get a little bit too close to the dog in a previous incident, and the dog gave a growl. So the dog gave a growl. That was a warning. That was letting the child know, hey, dude, you're on top of me. I don't like that. The dog didn't snap at the child, but it gave a warning, right? So the owners obviously were not happy about that. But you can see, if you're a dog person, if you understand dogs, that is, because I find that not all dog people understand dogs. So there's a difference there. But if you understand dogs, you understand that that makes sense, right? If a child starts climbing over a dog and the dog tells the child, please don't do that, they're very likely going to communicate that in the form of some sort of vocalization. Now, the humans don't like to hear that. They don't like to see that. They don't like to think about that. But it is the most appropriate way for the dog to tell the child, hey, please stop, okay? Because the dog doesn't speak English, so the best way for the dog to communicate that in the most effective manner possible without injuring the child would be to let the child know, hey, please stop that, in the form of some growling, some light growling, some vocalization. I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying it's acceptable. All I'm saying is it makes sense. That you could say it's normal, right? It's the animal communicating, giving feedback. Now, later, if the child is simply walking past and the dog goes out of his way to snap at the child, now that's not normal. Now we have abnormal. So why do I think it's abnormal instead of pathological? Well, I believe it's abnormal instead of pathological, meaning pathological doesn't make sense. Pathological would be more like, pathological would be like if there was no prior history of the child climbing on the dog. If there was no prior history of that, then I would say it's pathological. There is no root in normal behavior there. It doesn't make sense. But because there is history, that child has gotten a little bit too close to the dog. The dog possibly made an association. Child equals I get uncomfortable. But now what's happening is if the child is in the room, the dog snaps at the child. So it is not normal, but I don't believe it's pathological. Okay, I believe it's abnormal. It's an exaggeration of the norm, just like you said, which to me makes perfect sense. So pathological, I'm going to give you some examples of that where I've seen this, the owners have reported it, and after looking into it, just like he said, pathological would be if there's a hormonal change or a chemical change in the brain. I have talked to people that their dogs would be perfectly fine, hanging out, no problem, and then suddenly the dog would just snap. Okay, no reason, nobody's looking at the dog, nobody's touching the dog, nobody's making any noise. The dog is simply hanging out, and then suddenly it just turns, like just starts snapping and biting the closest thing to it. No apparent reason. It'll be fine with you, and then the next moment, boom, he's biting you. I have had more than one case like that. And when we looked into it, it was either some sort of hormonal issue. So we looked at the time frame of the dog's heat cycle with, with this particular time frame. Sometimes heat cycles can make females a little bit erratic. That does happen. Some hormonal changes during the heat cycle affect certain dogs more drastically than they do others. But in this particular case, with the dog that I just told you about, right, the dog would just be fine and just suddenly start snapping and biting the closest thing to it. This was really looked into. They contacted me for training. I knew right away this didn't make sense. There was no root in normal behavior. Nobody bothered the dog. The dog was a sweet dog. But when they looked into it, they realized the dog had a tumor, had a brain tumor, which that automatically will cause some sort of erratic behavior in the dog. I have another client that also reported something very similar. The dog was great. It had a great demeanor. And just one day, it just started turning on the owner, like aggressively bad. Like it was, and there was no reason for it. I know the owners love their dogs, and the dog just was fine. And suddenly, the dog just started really turn out of the blue. No, it was not the result of a correction. It was not instigated by any other factor. The owner was not antagonizing the dog. The owner was not harassing the dog. They were not even yelling at the dog. It would just go off on a simple walk. Simple walk. It happened in other occasions, not just on walks. It happened where just suddenly the owner got to a point where she had no idea when these random bursts of aggression would just occur unprovoked. So they took the dog to the vet. They did a lot of tests, and they found something similar. There was something off with the dog's chemical makeup, with the dog's chemistry in the brain. This was really looked at by veterinarians. It's really got researched. It's really got looked into, and that is what was diagnosed. That's how the dog was diagnosed. So there was something erratic about the dog's behavior. It was entirely pathological, meaning it didn't even make sense. It wasn't an exaggeration of normal. It was simply completely pathological, just no reason for it at all. And of course, in both of these cases that I just went over, that's what happened. Okay, the aggression was not an exaggeration of the norm. It was simply pathological. Some people will call it rage syndrome. You probably heard of that too. If you work with dogs, you probably heard something similar. And the name for that dog trainers give it is rage syndrome. On a side note, one thing that I found is dog trainers love to make up terminology. I don't know how accurate or how scientific the term rage syndrome is. It might be an actual syndrome. I don't know. But based on the years that I've been in the dog training industry, I've found that a lot of dog trainers will just come up with the term, catchy term, and then it picks up and becomes industry terminology that has no basis in reality. The name was not accurately described or given a terminology or a definition by the psychological scientific community at all. Not that I'm saying that that is wrong. All I'm saying is the term rage syndrome might have been one of these terms, but the term pathological aggression, pathological behavior, that is an actual term. You go to a veterinarian, you go to a animal psychologist, you go to a behaviorist, you're gonna hear the actual term pathological. Okay, even in human behavior, the term pathological makes sense. So that's what I wanted to go over here. It's a good book. I strongly recommend you make this part of your library and part of your toolbox. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. If you liked it, if you like this video, give me a like, share the video with somebody you think might find it helpful, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next episode.